So welcome everybody. How many of you, this is your first time to Discovery Park of America? Excellent. I always love it when there are first timers here. And I'm going to talk about David Crockett as advertised. But first, I just wanted to give you a little tiny taste of the backstory of Discovery Park of America. So you know, what the heck is this thing? When you pull in, most people are surprised by just how big it is. And fortunately, myself and those of us that work here, we get to see that view every single day as we pull in, and it never ceases to amaze, you know, that this is sitting here coming out of a cornfield. So it was first the vision of Robert and Jenny Kirkland. Robert Kirkland started the store Kirkland's that is a lot like perhaps a Pier 1 import type store. He and his cousin. They eventually sold it and did very well, and he invested his money and did very well. And Robert Kirkland, through his lifetime, loved to travel. He loved to explore other countries, other ideas, exposing people and his friends here and his family to new ways of thinking and interesting ideas was one of his passions. And so he decided he wanted to build a center of education here in Northwest Tennessee to serve this entire region. He put an ad in the paper that said, I want to build a center of education. If you're interested in joining me, come to this hotel at this time on this date, and we will work together to build this. Of course, he had no idea how many people were going to show up. More than 250 people showed up that day. He divided the room into tables. He put signs on each table that said things like science, agriculture, transportation, art, theater. And he said, I want you to all go to the table that has the topic that you are the most interested in. And those people went to those tables, and those became the committees. And they worked together for months to come up with, his assignment to them was, I want you to start tonight, and I want you to come up with what you would put in that section in a center for education. And so he took all of that research those folks had done, and he took it to the museum professionals. Now he had a vision for what he wanted, and so he went through a number of museum professionals before he finally got the team that he really liked that worked together to create Discovery Park of America. On opening day, he talked about how he wanted this to be a place that people could come back to again and again and be inspired and experience innovation. And so our mission here at Discovery Park is to inspire children and adults to see beyond. So whether you're the most highly educated person in West Tennessee, or you're a young child, a young student who's experiencing a lot of things for the first time, we want you to get something out of your experience here that will make you go home and want to find out more. A lot of the, you know, obviously you all know you're from this region. There are areas of our region that are distressed, very much underserved. A lot of the young people that come here with school groups, it's their very first time to ever see an escalator. And so it's it's a great metaphor that our escalators and our elevators are glass so that you can see how they work. What we want to do is trigger thought in young people so they'll learn more while they're here. A couple of things for those of you who haven't been here before, there's more here to experience than you really can in one day. But the things that I want to make sure those of you that are here for this event check out is our settlement. Outside, you'll find the settlement. Those are cabins that were brought in from neighboring fields, cotton fields, that were at risk of being torn down and lost forever. There are 13 cabins that were placed here in our settlement. We recently undertook a restoration project that the Robert and Jenny Kirkland Foundation funded for $500,000, or for $500,000, $500,000 is what it'll cost. We're refurbishing a lot of those cabins, and I'm not sure if they're here today or not, but you can oftentimes see the work going on. And so it's for those of you who are interested in history, it's a lot of fun to go out there and check that out. The other thing that I really don't want any of you to leave without checking out today is down in our ATA Traveling Exhibit Gallery. We have an exhibit called The Fascinating World of Murray Hudson's Globes and Maps. So Murray Hudson is an incredible guy who works out of Halls, Tennessee. Just out of curiosity, has anyone ever been to his facilities that he has there in Halls? Yeah, a few of you have. So those of you who've been there understand why when some of us went there, we were immediately captivated. It really is like stepping into a whole nother world, pardon the pun, but he is the foremost expert collector of maps and globes. The Smithsonian uses him. People who produce movies use him. He really is a brilliant guy right here in our region. And so we worked with him on an incredible exhibit of his globes and maps. Our internal team put that together with him. And I just think it's honestly one of the best exhibits that I've ever seen. So absolutely make sure that you check that out while you're here. If you love history, check out the train on one side of the park, and we have reproduction of the Liberty Bell. There's so much you can do on one side, and then on the other side there's the exhibit on innovation in agriculture, and then of course this whole building has things to experience. So when this is over with, feel free to have fun the whole day and even come back tomorrow if you'd like to. How many of you have heard of David Crockett? Awesome. Okay, unfortunately we're not going to start with David Crockett right now. How many of you have heard of Bart Simpson? Okay, Bart Simpson's almost as well known as David Crockett. So we're going to start our presentation with season 20, episode 5. I can't read that far. Episode 5 of The Simpsons. So Homer pulls in and says, "We're here." And Bart looks up where they're going to have their vacation. He goes, "A log cabin? What am I, Davy Crockett?" And then he skips a beat and he says, "Also, who's Davy Crockett?" So I think that's a lot of what young people, like the young gentleman we have in the back there, I think that's what they know, Davy Crockett. But then who's Davy Crockett? That was also the way I was 3 years ago when I came here. I noticed that here at Discovery Park of America, there's a Davy Crockett statue. There was a Davy Crockett exhibit that I just barely kind of passed by. But it did start to trigger in my mind, who's Davy Crockett? So I started researching and for my own fun, reading about Crockett to see why is it that someone from our region could become so famous that he would warrant a statue even today. And likeness and the history of Elvis and the history of other entertainers every day. And so I got to see a little bit of that of fame through that lens. And then after that, I worked at the museum in Washington, D.C. So I got to live there and be part of seeing how people dealt with political fame and things like that. So I was exploring David Crockett through that. So I came up with a lot of things that I thought were a little bit eye-opening. Now, you all are very smart and you're from around here and you're into history. So you may know all these things about David Crockett that I'm going to share with you. But just in case, I want us to do a pop quiz. I want to test your knowledge on David Crockett. And through this, we're going to share a little bit about what's in the book. But of course, me standing up here reading would be super boring. So we're going to do a pop quiz. And these two guys back here in the back, I know they got a lot of this. But first of all, everybody's kind of nervous usually when you're in an event like this. People don't want to speak out. So this first one, we're gonna do a practice run together. We're gonna read this slide out loud together. So everybody read with me. Born on a mountaintop in Tennessee, greenest state in the land of the free, raised in the woods so he knew every, killed him when he was only 3, Davy Crockett. See, it's amazing. I can see even those kids' mouths moving back there. So it's interesting. You can ask somebody, what do you know about Davy Crockett? And they'll start to tell you this. So this has resonated all the way to now. So this is going to be a piece of cake. Y'all are going to get all these right. Okay, Crockett wore a, that's right. Most of us, when we think of David Crockett, this is what we think of, thanks to Fess Parker. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But David Crockett really didn't look like that any more than any other Kentucky or Tennessee person who was out hunting and wanted to keep their head warm. When he was actually living his life, he looked a lot more like this. He looked like everybody else, his peers in Washington. But I was very curious because of the transition that David Crockett, the person, went through to become Davy Crockett, the brand, the entertainment brand. I was curious, what did he really look like? And so I did find a couple of places that actually, I was looking through everything I could find for eyewitnesses of what did he really look like. In various places, and this is from the book, in various places, he was described by those who laid eyes on him as tall in stature and large in frame, about 6 feet high and stoutly built. Crockett's neighbor, John L. Jacobs, remembered that he was about 6 feet high, weighed about 200 pounds, had no surplus flesh. He was broad-shouldered, stood erect, was a man of great physical strengths. One of his sons wrote in 1889, "My father was a fraction over 6 feet tall, weighed over 200 pounds, was in good health, and was not fleshy." A reporter writing about him when Crockett was in Pennsylvania wrote, "In person, he is rather above the medium height. He is about 50 years of age. His features are expressive. We may even say handsome, particularly when he smiles. He is muscular and wears all the indications of excellent health. A bright and laughing eye, a ruddy cheek, and a row of teeth that would shame the whiteness of ivory. He says he can outgrin a panther, but he never grinned the bark off a tree. He is not witty, yet there is a dryness in his anecdotes and a kind of blunt good humor, which makes them amusing and even instructive." So, I think we could summarize from all the things I read about the descriptions that he did have a great deal of charisma. People wrote about when he walked into a room, you were aware that the temperature of the room had changed. So he absolutely was somebody who had that thing that celebrities have that you never can quite know what it is. Okay, obviously there's a Davy and David thing going on. So what was he really called? Colonel David Crockett, was something that he and his friends, tossed around, I'm sure, people who he represented called him Congressman David Crockett. And even just David Crockett, people called him that. But what they never called him was Davy Crockett, unless they wanted to insult him. In many ways, Davy Crockett was a pejorative. It would be like if, my name is Scott, if somebody wanted to sort of minimize my opinion, they could call me Little Scotty, and say, just ignore what Little Scotty has to say. So that's why Davy was sort of, it was something that he did not want anybody to call him Davy. And I only saw that for the most part in negative while he was living. Now, of course, he went through a transition after his death in which that sort of became the norm. Okay, this was another thing that was kind of, a little bit confusing and upsetting for people who are from East Tennessee. Some people, they really own Davy Crockett in East Tennessee, and they've done a lot for tourism and a lot to capitalize on that connection. But my book is about David Crockett's relationship with our region. My book starts off when he came here. David Crockett's relationship with our region. My book starts off when he came here and settled in 1822, and when he built his home here, when he hunted around Reelfoot Lake, which was still new. And I am going to take a side note to do a really quick little commercial, and it's also a recommendation. If you are here today and you have time after this is over with and you do want to learn more about the formation of Reelfoot Lake, we have an interactive Reelfoot Lake earthquake experience here. You can get a ticket at the main ticket window. And then it's the ground shakes and it's surround. It's a really fun experience to learn how Reelfoot Lake was formed. So anyway, David Crockett was very much a part of West Tennessee. And so now I will be honest, I knew there would be some concern when I put West Tennessee's David Crockett in the book, but I did not expect so much anger and so many posts of people trying to school me and calling me an idiot and all kinds of bad names because I said West Tennessee's David Crockett. People would say, this idiot doesn't know anything. David Crockett is from East Tennessee. So anyway, so that's why for me, my focus was on West Tennessee's David Crockett. There are people, and my book doesn't go into the exact locations of all the cabins that David Crockett lived in. And also, so David Crockett was a very fun person to write about, but what really clearly comes out when you start to look at all of the detail is that he was someone who spent way more money than he made. And so he frequently was having to sell land, trade land, squat, keep moving. But there are people from the past, many who are no longer with us, who have spent hours researching the exact points of where all his cabins were. And so all the libraries that I visited around here have records of where the cabins are located. So if you're really curious and you want to go out there, I didn't go see any of them because everyone told me they're just sitting in, they're empty spaces in cornfields and soybean fields and, have cows in them now. But there is one, if you're from anywhere around here, then you know the folks in Rutherford. There was a banker in the 30s who a farmer came in and said, look, I've got the last cabin David Crockett lived in on my land, and I'm ready to get that sucker off of there because I'm ready to plant some cotton on there. And so the banker said, let me buy it from you. Very little amount of money. He bought the wood and stored it away. In the 50s, of course, when the David Crockett boom happened, the smart folks back then in Rutherford said, you know what, we're sitting on a gold mine. Why don't we take some of that wood and build a cabin? And we can call it Davy Crockett's cabin. We can move his mother. His mother was buried in a field somewhere. And they said, let's exhume her and rebury her next to the cabin. So they did that. And they really did a lot of promotion around it and postcards and souvenirs. And I've gone to visit it. It's still there, and they will let you tour it. They've recently really been working on it and making it an experience all on its own. And so Discovery Park folks have been working with them a little bit on some ways that they could maybe make it available for people to see it without having to have a person there. There was a couple that spent a lot of time in that house every day welcoming visitors and doing tours, and they have I know he has since passed away, and so they're looking for, how do you take the history and extend it, which of course we all know how important that is. Okay, just for the specifics, David Crockett was a Tennessee state legislator from 1821 to 1824. He was a congressman representing West Tennessee from 1827 to 1831, 1833 to 1835, and those were the counties in Tennessee that he represented. I was personally interested in Haywood County because that's where my ancestors came from. In 1833, several wagon trains of members of Cape Hearts Baptist Church in Bertie County, North Carolina, They got together and they said, hey, let's buy that new land down there in Tennessee and let's go together as a group so that, we can help support each other. Well, both sides of my family come out of those wagon trains of people. They settled in Haywood County area and no one ever left until my parents left to go to college in Memphis. So, it was really interesting for me to think about the fact that, David Crockett was their congressman. He represented them. So was Crockett famous in his lifetime? Absolutely, yes. He was famous, and that was the meat of this for me, is I was trying to figure out, how did he become famous? And so he became famous a lot of different ways, but there are things that he did just by his gut that nobody had ever done before. And while he was motivated by wanting to make money, there were people who were making money off of David Crockett. He wanted a piece of the action. He saw all these people are making money off of me. I'm not. So he wrote a book to sell, to begin trying to figure out ways to make money. Another thing he did that was unique, that hadn't really done before, is he had a catchphrase. You can see here on the book that he wrote, his catchphrase right here. I leave this rule for others: when I am dead, be always sure you're right, then go ahead. So that was his catchphrase. He would write it on books. He would write it on all different types of tools that would help people associated with him. The word "go ahead" became heavily associated with him. Every article would say, they would use "go ahead" as, as an ironic statement, but it was really associated with him. He was he was the first celebrity to produce an image of himself, to reproduce it with his autograph and his catchphrase. And he sold this publicly to make money off of it. Now, he absolutely, on all these endeavors that he did to make money, he always spent more money than he made. So he was then in a position where he needed to make more money. Because it's expensive to be a celebrity. I thought this was an interesting story when Tom Thumb had a carriage made in London. He had "go ahead" printed on the side as an homage to David Crockett. Another example of how he managed his own fame and how David Crockett, how he orchestrated how his public image comes from John Gatsby Chapman, who was a painter who painted a lot of the politicians in DC of the day. I personally felt a little bit of connection to John Gatsby Chapman because his studio was right over by where the museum is in Washington, DC, which is where I worked for 5 years before I came here. So every day, of course, when you're in Washington, you're surrounded by history, but it was interesting that I picked up on that little bit of history. So John Gatsby Chapman was going to paint David Crockett. This is the painting he did. And I'm going to read you just a little bit because this was one of my favorite stories. And it was also cool that Chapman wrote a lot about his experience with Crockett years and years later. And from the book, Crockett complained to Chapman that all the previous painters had made him look sort of like, and in Crockett's words, a cross between a clean-shirted member of Congress and a Methodist preacher. No offense to the Methodists out there. After a quick glance at this first painting, Crockett was only slightly impressed with what he saw. Perhaps he was just thinking out loud or mumbling to himself, but his observation came out almost as a challenge. Many years later, Chapman wrote his memory of that moment when the idea for the final painting of Crockett was born. Crockett had mused, "If you could catch me on a bear hunt in a hurricane with hunting tools and gear and a team of dogs, you might make a better picture worth looking at." Chapman responded that he would certainly be happy to try, but it would have to be painted on a large canvas, as he had never seen either a bear hunt or a hurricane. Crockett would have to show him what those things look like. And so they started working together on this project. David Crockett bought a gun for him to hold from a man in Alexandria. Crockett got all the clothing together that he wanted to be painted in. Chapman had said, "Don't worry about the dogs. I have hunting dogs." And on the day when they got ready to paint, David Crockett shut it down because the dogs were too fancy. He said, those are not the kind of dogs that we use in Tennessee. Will you grab me one of those waters right there on the corner of that table? He said, those are not the kind of dogs that we use in Tennessee. Thank you. And so David Crockett and this fancy painter go out into the streets of Washington, D.C. Now, I don't know if they stole the dogs or if they rented the dogs, or it doesn't say anything. Chapman's memory was they went out and they got dogs and brought them back to the studio, and they got started painting. But he remembers that the sketches, the preliminary work, it just wasn't quite there for Crockett. And so finally, and I write a little bit more about that in the book, but Crockett comes in, he says, I got it. The reason I don't like it is because I don't look friendly. I want you to paint this so that I'm waving a hat in the air like I've just seen my neighbor and I'm saying, howdy, neighbor. You know, and so this is the picture that they came up with. This is actually a copy of the picture they came up with. The original, Chapman tried to sell the original, and there's a really interesting story of the actual painting of what happened to it through the years. But ultimately, it was at the Austin courthouse that burned to the ground. The Austin, Texas courthouse burned to the ground, and this picture and several other Crockett pictures, paintings were destroyed. And so this is a reproduction that Chapman had painted because he wanted to have another copy of it. So this isn't the actual one that burned, but it's a similar one. And so I just think that's fascinating that David Crockett was that involved in what he was doing. With how he looked. There was also a play that traveled the country while David Crockett was alive. It was called The Lion in the West, and it was based loosely on Crockett, but the actual character was called Nimrod Wildfire, you know, Nimrod being the hunter in the Bible. The script of the play was filled with language like what's on the screen. You know, I'm half horse, half alligator, a touch of the earthquake. It's got the prettiest sister, the fastest horse, and the ugliest dog in the district. This kind of language that was in the play was actually lifted in the cities that the play was performed in and put in the newspaper. And then the other newspapers would pick it up and write it and run the stories. And so everybody suddenly thought, this is how David Crockett talked. This is what David Crockett said. And so suddenly there was a very thin line between the character and the real person that blurred. And from then on, the things that James Hackett acted on stage were repeated as truth. And there was one time Crockett had never seen the play. And so he was going to be in Washington, D.C., and he worked with the people who produced the play to have it in D.C. while he was there. And people knew he was going to be there, but he wasn't there yet. And so people who were there describe what happened, you know, when the lights go down and then somebody was led down to the front row. Of course, everybody knew it was David Crockett. And so James Hackett, before he started the play, the lights came up a little bit and he came in and bowed to David Crockett, and David Crockett stood up and bowed back to him. The crowd went wild and they wrote about it. And it was, you know, a real fun moment in pop culture history. So everybody's got to have a nemesis in order to be a successful hero. Do you know who David Crockett's nemesis was? Anybody? Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson and David Crockett hated each other. And I don't know if they hated each other personally, but they hated each other professionally. And so Andrew Jackson needed his cronies and the Tennessee delegates and all the people who were Jacksonian Democrats. He needed them to vote the way he told them to. He needed them to toe the line. Well, David Crockett was kind of the opposite of that. In a lot of ways, he was a contrarian. And he wasn't going to be told how to vote or what to do. And so these two, their dislike for each other and Crockett's popularity caused him to be somebody that the Whigs looked at. I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit, but the Whigs and other people that were against Jackson started paying close attention to the fact that this guy's super popular, and yet he is brave enough to stand up against this guy who thinks he's the king of America. So were Native Americans Crockett's enemies. David Crockett Indian killer is something that you hear all the time that, is associated with him. Well, of course, like other people who were settlers, he was afraid of the Indians and he fought, in the Creek War, but he was more of a hunter. And so he would just provide food. He was really not a killer from everything I've seen. He was not somebody who was an Indian killer like this. I think it's interesting too how we've changed in our culture for the better, of course. This was a little kid's pop-up book, and you think about what that is on that, it's pretty crazy. So Andrew Jackson needed to get the Indians off the land, and he had done everything. You all have read, I'm sure, tons of books about Andrew Jackson. But his positioning was, as many of you know, he positioned it towards the end that for the good of the Native Americans, we need to get them off the land and far away where we can't see them. He said, look, we've done everything we could to try to get them to acclimate. They won't acclimate. So let's put them where they'll be safe and we can take their land and farm it. So a lot of that was a lie. A lot of the Native Americans had acclimated. They had cabins just like everybody else. They dressed in clothes like everybody. A lot of the Native Americans were sending their kids up east to school, but it behooved him to position it that way, and it helped relieve everybody's guilt to be able to say, "Oh, we're doing it because it's for their own good." David Crockett wasn't buying it. He said, several of my colleagues got around me and told me how well they loved me and that I was ruining myself. They said this was a favorite measure of the president and I ought to go for it. I told them I believe this was a wicked, unjust measure and that I should go against it, let the cost to myself be what it might. Well, he did. He voted against David Crockett's bill. He was the only Tennessean to vote against it. But of course, they lost. The Native Americans certainly paid the price. And David Crockett ultimately paid the price. So David Crockett had his eye on the ultimate political prize. He wanted to go to be president in Washington, D.C. And there was a sliver of a moment there where it looked like it might be possible. The Whigs, as I mentioned earlier, were watching the crowds go crazy. And if you read some of the reports of what happened, it was unlike anything that anybody had ever experienced before. Wherever he would go on a book tour, Philadelphia, Washington, Boston, the crowds were, huge, screaming, wanting to get a look at him. In one part of the story that I picked up out of a newspaper article, he was his carriage had come around the corner and he saw the crowd, and suddenly he was for one of the few times intimidated and kind of nervous. And then he saw a kid in the crowd who screamed, "Go ahead, Davy Crockett." And so he was like, "I can do it." So he went ahead and, it's a fun story to me to read. So he was going to, I photoshopped that just in case y'all are curious. His plan was he was going to win his congressional seat, and then he was going to run against Little Van, who he called, anybody know who Little Van would be? Exactly. So he was going to run against Little Van, who he called Little Van. He never said Martin Van Buren. He always said Little Van as an insult, made Andrew Jackson and the Jacksonites and everybody, the Jacksonians furious. And so they were going to do everything they could to get rid of him. So the next congressional race, David Crockett ran against Adam Huntsman. Has anybody heard of Adam Huntsman? So Adam Huntsman was actually a very good guy. I mean, he was a very good candidate. He cared about the people of this region, and he wanted to beat David Crockett, and he had a good shot at it. He wrote a letter to James K. Polk, who was trying to help orchestrate all of this and get David Crockett back to Tennessee. And so basically Adam Huntsman wrote and said, David Crockett keeps sending this anti-Jackson material here to Tennessee, and it's making people mad. So I think that it's doing more damage than good. I also think if he doesn't get his land bill passed, then I got a real good shot. So David Crockett had been trying, when he was in Washington, he was trying to get a land bill through that would help the squatters of Tennessee be able to keep the land that they had squatted on. of course, James Polk and the cronies in Nashville wanted the most money they could get out of the land. And so they didn't care if they had to push people off. 4,652 to 4,400. Crockett did everything he could to keep that from being official. He called a recount. He stomped his feet. He wrote a bunch of mean stuff. He was furious. And it didn't help that a lot of the newspaper articles you read around that time about his loss are brutal. And while he presented himself as someone who had a thick skin, he really had a thin skin. And I can only imagine how things like this hurt. Crockett will find the business of coon hunting, which he will now resume, much better suited to his genius than legislation. The Whigs have used him until he is used up. And so, I'm sure he read things like that and had to face his neighbors here in this region and sell it. Crockett will find the business of coon hunting, which he will now resume, much better suited to his genius than legislation. The Whigs have used him until he is used up. And so, I'm sure he read things like that and had to face his neighbors here in this region. And he was mad. So now we're gonna go into the next chapter of where Crockett died. So everybody knows, you all know, I'm sure, that Crockett died in Texas. But the question is, why did he go to Texas? He wrote this over and over and over again. I could never really find where he originally said it, but he wrote it over and over again. I told the people of my district that I would serve them faithfully as I had done, but if not, they might go to heck, and I will go to Texas. And so that's a famous saying. Now, I'm sure you've all been to Texas, seen the Alamo. They have this statement everywhere, on T-shirts, on billboards, the Texans love David Crockett. So he's a big hero in Texas. So why did he go to Texas? Well, his daughter, this is his third or fourth great granddaughter, on October 14th, 1950, produced a letter that David Crockett had written her ancestor. And it does a great job, I think, of really stating why was he going to, he wasn't going to Texas to be a big hero, to die in the Alamo. He wrote in his letter to his daughter, Margaret Crockett Flowers, Texas has the best land and the best prospects for health I ever saw. And I do believe it is a fortune to any man to come here. There is a world of country here to settle. I have taken the oath of government and have enrolled my name as a volunteer, because all volunteers is entitled to vote for a member to form a constitution for this province. I am in hopes of making a fortune yet for myself and my family, as bad as my prospects has been. So he is seeing one more opportunity to finally make some money. And he also thinks if he can get back involved in the government of the new province, then he can hightail it right back into Washington, like his buddy Sam Houston had done. So unfortunately, famous death of David Crockett at the Alamo has been well documented in movies and paintings and stories and songs. And this only escalated his fame. Now, most of the things that you'll see follow the narrative that David Crockett was a huge hero who stormed into the Alamo, who tried to protect the people, who killed the Mexican soldiers until he was out of bullets. And then he picked up his gun and he used it as a bat, to kill even more. Well, there's a lot of indication that that is not the truth. Although most paintings, this one, David Crockett, is in the lower right-hand corner. Most things you see, that's sort of the prevailing idea. I mentioned earlier how kids back in the day in the 50s had a different type of product that they were allowed to buy. Can you imagine kids nowadays having a lunchbox with people murdering each other? There's even a dead person laying there with a gun next to them. So your kid would get sent home from school if you sent their lunch in that today. But anyway, so this was the prevailing theory. There's a lot of controversy over this now. Some people recently wrote a book that had some alternatives of what happened, or some motivations that happened, and it just, freaked everybody out to their core. Exactly how he died at the Alamo, whether he was killed afterwards, there's a theory some eyewitnesses. There was a group of people that did remain alive after the fighting stopped. And there was a group of people who did surrender and say, you know, hey, we don't really have a lot to do with this. Can we leave now? And they were all murdered and burned with the rest of the people who died in fire, you know, on a funeral pyre. So however he died, he died. Now, it's interesting that his death, because he was famous already, and here he died in the Alamo, his death led to him being even more famous than he was before. And I would contend that his son went on to run for a position in Congress after his father's death, which he won. And then he actually got that land bill that his father had been working on. He got that land bill passed in many ways out of paying tribute to David Crockett, who was now branded as this ultimate volunteer who sacrificed his life, you know, for the benefit of those at the Alamo. But the other connection, you know, I mentioned I worked for Elvis Presley Enterprises. Of course, I always still hear about Elvis sightings. People will say, you know, Elvis was still alive. Here's where we saw him. David Crockett was the same way. Elvis sightings constantly. There were newspaper reports of where he had been seen, you know, in this area, he was doing this. And there was one that was so, it had so many elements that might make it something to consider, that his son and his family got Washington to send some soldiers down to Mexico to a mine to interview a guy who they said was David Crockett, and who could have been, but was not. So David Crockett did die at the Alamo. Now, here's another question for you. Did Walt Disney kill David Crockett? I'm going to say he did, and here's why. So obviously everybody knows the story of Walt Disney building Disneyland in California, and he had a deal with ABC that was a great promotional deal. He would run specials that would tie into, he would run special programming on ABC that would tie into the different elements of the park. And so he had a production company going and he had this theme park going. The two would merge together. It was great. So for Frontiersland, his expert writers were supposed to come back and make some presentations. Here's some programming we could do around the wild, wild west and the frontier. And Davy Crockett is one they brought to him. And he thought, it's okay. He was into that. So he went ahead and ran with it. And what they produced was way more successful than they ever thought it would be. In the picture in the upper right is Walt Disney and Fess Parker in the parade on the opening day of Disneyland. And you'll see why Walt Disney became a big Davy Crockett fan. The show premiered on December 15th, 1954 to an audience of 40 million. That meant 70% of the households with the TV were watching Davy Crockett that night. That was unheard of for one network to get that many people. And so suddenly they realized, I'm sure the next morning they were all looking at each other, how are we going to capitalize on this? How are we going to make money off of this? They had shot it in color and had broken it up into 4 episodes, but they were airing it in black and white. And so what they, unfortunately, you know, in their episodes, the hero dies in the end in the Alamo. So they didn't have a hero they couldn't make a series that could keep on going. So they took the color version, popped it all together and created a movie that then aired, which gave it even more exposure to Davy Crockett. We all sang the song earlier about Davy Crockett. This is speaking of kids and doing things. You don't see a lot of pictures nowadays of kids holding guns and pointing them at each other. It launched a firestorm unlike anything anybody had ever experienced. All these coonskin caps they have on. After the enormous popularity of the episodes, children's coonskin caps sold at an average of 5,000 per day. Journalist Mike Flanagan wrote about what happened next. Merchandising not being the well-oiled animal it is today, retailers were at a loss when customers came in waving dollars desperately, seeking non-existent coonskin hats. In the ensuing madness, raccoon tails soared from 25 cents a pound to $8 and more. When the country's raccoon population couldn't meet the demand, hunters went after foxes and skunks. So, this ignited both raccoon hat craze, but also if you just Google, Davy Crockett paraphernalia or Davy Crockett artifact, you'll find thousands and thousands and thousands of things for sale still, that are out there on eBay and that people are selling. So it's really interesting. At one point, there were like 800 manufacturers working on Davy Crockett things in the 50s to try to meet the demand. And, it came big, but then it went away really just as quickly. It went away. So I really think that phase and that popularity of creating this brand of Davy Crockett is really what overshadowed David Crockett, in a big way. Of course, David Crockett didn't want to be made fun of. He didn't. I forgot to tell you, this was another part that was fascinating. It was music too. I don't want to skip this. So the original version of Davy Crockett that we talked about in the beginning, it was #1 on the Billboard chart for 4 weeks. And, a hit, everybody wanted to cover it. So all the bands that covered it, it ended up selling 16 million records in 6 months, which, we're not record people, so we don't have any thing to compare it to. Bing Crosby's Silent Night sold 10 million. Hound Dog sold 10 million. Celine Dion's My Heart Will Go On, 18 million. So it sold a lot of records. So that's one of the reasons why everybody still can sing it today. Lest you think it's an old brand, if you go to Disneyland Paris, you can stay at Disney's Davy Crockett Ranch. Still today, the salad bars are all made out of old wagons, and there are carved animals everywhere. I'm sure that they are trying to replicate what they think people in our region must live like. So we should all go over there and experience it. Maybe we could be consultants for them. So back to what I was saying, would David Crockett mind the fact that Davy Crockett has really absorbed his brand? I would contend that he would be fine with this being his image now if he could somehow capitalize off of it. If he could make a buck off of it, I think today he would be an influencer. He would be having events. He would be selling more posters. He would be a branding and manufacturing whiz. And to really drive that point home, do you remember Adam Huntsman, who I was talking about a while ago, who quite frankly was a much better congressman, who made much more of a contribution in that world? Well, a lot of you weren't familiar with Adam Huntsman, but if you are ever in Jackson, Tennessee, and you are near the Madison County Solid Waste Center, there's an Adam Huntsman marker right there on the side of the road. So he has not been completely forgotten, but I suspect that David Crockett would much prefer what he has now versus just being a little tiny marker somewhere on the side of the road. So it's been fun sharing you guys a little bit about the book. You can find a lot more. I put a lot on Facebook just because it's fun. I have a Facebook page out there just about the book. So if you like David Crockett, go out there and join the Facebook page. You can buy the book on Amazon. It's for sale here at Discovery Park. And you can just Google. I also have a website for the book that has all the links. It's therealdavidcrockett.com is the website. So you can go check that out as well. Are there any questions? I do want to make the point that I am not an academic, obviously. I have a journalism degree. So for me, this was more like a journalism project of researching and trying to figure out what people will find interesting and making sure that the facts were accurate, that I was, giving as clear of a picture as I could. But I'm happy to take any questions. And if I don't know the answer, there's probably people in this audience that do. Yes, sir.
Can you tell us about the image on the cover of the book?
Yeah, absolutely. So the image on the cover of the book is, that's one of the paintings of David Crockett, but I thought, it would be cool if, David Crockett was around, he would probably slip on a pair of Tom Cruise celebrity sunglasses. And so I went to my wife, who's a portrait artist, and said, here's the David Crockett portrait. I want you to paint me something with Davy Crockett wearing cool Tom Cruise sunglasses. So that's what she came out. I think she did a great job And then I've got a friend, Tom Martin, who's a book designer, and he helped me take that painting and design it. So thank you. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Do you think of any questions anybody in this room could ask that will not be answered in the book?
That's a good question. Well, first of all, there are literally hundreds of books about David Crockett that explore many other aspects of his life. There's entire books about David Crockett and the Alamo. There's one book that really traces David Crockett's trail and tells you the attractions that are there. So there's a lot of things like that. My book is more focused on West Tennessee and also the fame aspects. You know, I tried to put things in my book that are not in other books, because when I was researching, somebody wrote, a person who was critiquing another David Crockett book, not the one I was working on, said the last thing the world needs is another book about David Crockett. So I got to make sure mine's very different. So there's a lot of things, yeah, that are in there. Yes, ma'am.
You showed a quote early. It was somewhat derogatory toward Kentuckians. Talk about that attitude with David Crockett.
No, there were the reason, and I should have pointed that out. Thank you. So when the people in the East were thinking about the things that were going on down here in the West, it was all, they had never been here. They couldn't imagine it. So it was all, not a lot of people had been here across the mountains. And so a lot of times they referred to this whole area as Old Kentuck. So for some people, David Crockett was from Kentucky. They also called it the Western District. It went by a lot of names, and a lot of the reason, and I go into more detail on that in the book, a lot of the reasons why David Crockett became so famous and so popular, I should say, is because he represented what must be over those mountains. Everybody in the Western District must be funny and outrageous and, a good person. Otherwise, why would we want to get rid of all the Native Americans and push them all away? It's because we want to make room for these nice, happy, cheerful, funny people that live in Old Kentuck or in the Western District. Yes, sir.
Let me ask a variation on the previous question. Is there anything you wanted to find out about Crockett that you weren't able to find out? Almost every book you have, there's something that you couldn't quite nail down, you couldn't quite figure out. Is there anything that eluded?
Yeah, a lot, because David Crockett wrote a lot, but he wrote a lot because he was building an image. And so I didn't take anything he wrote about himself or anything he said happened. I didn't take it at face value. I really had to look and try and find corroborating proof of those kind of things. Oftentimes I did it, so I would note that, it's here's what David Crockett said he did. There wasn't a lot of proof. I would like to know, the one thing that I think a lot of people will, and this is just pure me being nosy, this is really none of my business, but I'm curious about his relationship with his second wife. Here she was this, and really I should have a slide in here about her, because, his first wife died after having a lot of kids and, childbirth, and him being away. He wasn't around a lot, and he got a lot of criticism because he wasn't really a good husband. She died. He remarried a woman with a lot of money who, it was her money that enabled him to be able to live the life that he lived. He could spend more money than he made because he had his second wife had money, knew how to run a business, knew how to run the farm. She kept things going. And a lot of people speculate. There's a lot of speculation, She got very comfortable living without him being around. And so when he came back, he didn't live with her. He lived in a different cabin, And so, the indication would be that they probably were separated, and both comfortable being that way. He also, when he was in Washington, he, enjoyed adult beverages, it would appear. He had a lot of friends. He went to a lot of parties. And there's a thing in the book about, when him and Sam Houston, went out and, signed some registers of some ladies that they were visiting. And anyway, so I wish there was a little bit more about that I could have written about, but it doesn't exist. Yes, sir.
This wasn't the focus of the book about the question that I have is, did you ever come across any evidence as to where was David Crockett's primary residence in West Tennessee? I know he had 3 cabins, all within 2 or 3 miles. All of those cabins were in Wheaton County. He's considered the favorite son of Gibson County, but he never lived in Gibson.
Right. Well, and what I found was, and I did start down the path of that.
Every book has a different
Well,
county.
right. Well, and part of the problem is the county lines moved a lot. So what might be one place, suddenly I'm looking 5 years later, it's in a different county. And so at some point I just decided, you know what? No one's going to find this interesting. And so I need to quit wasting so much time on it. So, the slide I showed of there are people who have spent, and I wish I could think of his name, but one guy really, yeah, what's his name?
I can't, he put every property that he ever owned.
Yeah, and that's very, very valuable. It's a lot of times it's just in folders and photocopies, and it's a valuable thing for the future, but it just wasn't really. And at one point I made plans for one weekend to go and try to track down as many of the spots as I could. And I thought, you know what, they're all cornfields now. So, and that's why, he definitely made his home in Northwest Tennessee in a variety of the counties that existed then, and spent a lot of time in all the counties. Of course, he spent a lot of time in Jackson. That's where he would trade his furs, and he had a lot of friends in Jackson and Memphis. One of my favorite stories in the book is about Marcus Winchester. How much more time do I have? Oh, you were okay? Okay. I'll do like 5 more minutes and then we'll get out of here. This is a beautiful big place for you guys to explore, so I don't want to take up your time. Marcus Winchester, his father was the Winchester who worked with Andrew Jackson and John Overton to purchase and settle Memphis. Well, they sent Marcus Winchester, who had been educated up east and was by all, everything you read, was a pretty sophisticated guy, very smart. And he was the mayor of Memphis. He really ran the business of Memphis. David Crockett had this great idea in between when in the years between his 2 congressional runs. He thought, what I'm going to do is barrel staves were hugely needed because people use barrels for everything. So he was on the Obion River. He owned land, and so he cut down the trees. He hired people he built a little lumber mill, and he produced barrel staves. And his plan was to put them on boats, because he had these people build boats, and they had 2 big boats full of barrel staves. They were going to float it down the Obion, hit the Mississippi, and go down to New Orleans and sell them. He was going to use the money he made to pay the guys who were helping him. Well, he was hopeful, and hope is not a strategy, as we say around here. He was hopeful that those guys knew how to pilot a boat. Well, they were okay. They were okay on the Obion River, but when they got to the Mississippi, all heck broke loose, and the boats were going crazy, and things were falling off. And finally, they tied the 2 boats together. Their plan was to stop somewhere. Their plan was to stop in Memphis, but they didn't get that far. They hit, a place where there were trees, and everything was stacked up. And David Crockett had been inside. They hit this thing. He had been asleep. He was taking a nap, and there was a little tiny window he had to get through to get out. And they rescued him. They pulled him out, and in the process, he ended up with no clothes on. So he was completely naked, and he was holding on to trees. Well, finally, some people from Memphis came down in their ferry boat and rescued them, took them to Memphis, and Crockett met Marcus Winchester, and the 2 hit it off immediately. Marcus Winchester was also a guy who marched to the beat of his own drum, because he had a wife who was not white. Now, whether she was part Indian, or black or part black, we don't know, but anything other than white at the time made you an outcast. So interestingly, he loved her so much that he didn't care about that. They couldn't even live in the city of Memphis because it was against the rules, against the law for for anybody to live together, who were one white person and one non-white person. So anyway, she was supposedly a very beautiful woman, and it was really interesting research and all that. And I actually cut some of that from the book because I got so interested in Marcus Winchester's life that I started putting too much in it. So I had to cut that out. But anyway, Marcus Winchester started funding David Crockett's campaigns and started giving him money to run, which of course made his father and Andrew Jackson, made them all furious. And so there's all this correspondence saying, quit supporting David Crockett. He's a bad guy. We're against him. Why are you supporting him? But Marcus Winchester and he stayed friends all the way to the end. David Crockett's last night in Tennessee, he spent with Marcus Winchester and a lot of the other Memphis friends he had. Time went on Beale Street, and or whatever it was called then. And there's a story in the book about their last night together and what they did and what David Crockett did, and because a lot of those guys lived on, and wrote about their memories, and so I could pull up a few of those and see what happened. But they stayed buddies all the way to the end, so I love that aspect. I don't even remember the question that got me started on all that, but.
Would you ask people on Zoom if there's any questions?
Yeah, if there's any questions for the folks on Zoom, just type them in the comments and we'll get those as well. Any other questions in here? Yes, sir.
Do you remember when Best Parker was here in Union City in the Christmas parade?
People have told me about that before.
It must have been in the early 60s.
Yeah. Fess Parker, obviously he had a hard time being typecast, but he did, do the public speaking and the parades, and he he capitalized, if that's not an ugly word, he took advantage of his celebrity and did that, but then he bought a winery in California and spent the last years of his life as with a vineyard.
He couldn't be satisfied with David Crockett. He turned to be Daniel Boone.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's right. And people have asked me, "Well, do you want to write about Daniel Boone?" And for whatever reason, I have to have a connection to the people that I wrote about. My first book that I wrote about was on Richard Halliburton, who was an explorer and an adventurer who came from Haywood County. And that just came out of, I did a blog about him on my genealogy blog. I'm big into genealogy, and a publisher emailed me and said, would you like to write a book about Richard Halliburton? So I did. And the second book was about Odd McIntyre, who was a journalist, who was the first entertainment reporter, who came out of Gallipolis, Ohio, because I was working at the museum and I was about, all about the news. It was an interesting book. So any questions from Zoom? Okay, cool. Any other questions? Okay, we're good. Oh, yes, ma'am. He was,
Was he living in West?
yeah, he was, by the time he got here, it was already a big lake, and it had been for about a decade. And he did write about what he found when he was here and about how, he would be hunting and he would run across a group of Native Americans that were also hunting. So anyway, yeah. All right. Thank you so much for having me here.